I never meant to become involved in their lives. That's what I keep telling myself, even now, months after everything happened. I was just trying to live quietly in my little corner of Maple Grove, a forgettable suburb where nothing interesting was supposed to happen. But sometimes, life has other plans. Sometimes, you become a witness whether you want to or not. It started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in September. I remember because it was the day I finally got around to painting my front door, a project I'd been putting off all summer. I was standing on my porch, admiring my handiwork, a deep navy blue that made the brass knocker really pop, when I saw the moving truck pull up to number 42. The house at number 42 had been empty for almost a year. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had retired to Florida, and the property had sat vacant ever since, its garden growing wild and untamed. I'd watched potential buyers come and go, but none had stuck around. Until now. The new owners emerged from a sleek black SUV that followed the moving truck. They made quite the picture, him in an expensive-looking suit, her in a flowing summer dress that caught the breeze. They looked like they'd stepped out of a real estate advertisement, all perfect smiles and coordinated outfits. "Hi there." The woman waved at me, her smile bright and genuine. "I'm Sarah Bennett. And this is my husband, James." I introduced myself, and we chatted briefly about the neighborhood. Sarah seemed eager to make friends, while James stood slightly apart, checking his phone and occasionally glancing at his watch. There was something about him that made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or how his hand stayed firmly on Sarah's lower back, guiding her movements in ways that seemed just a bit too controlling. But I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, who was I to judge? They seemed like a normal, successful couple starting a new chapter of their lives. I even brought over a housewarming gift the next day, a potted orchid that Sarah exclaimed over with genuine delight. The first few weeks were quiet. I'd see Sarah in her garden sometimes, trying to tame the wilderness the Hendersons had left behind. She'd wave and chat, telling me about her plans for the space. She wanted to plant roses, she said, and maybe start a vegetable garden in the spring. James was rarely around during the day. He worked in finance, Sarah explained, which meant long hours at the office. It wasn't until October that I started noticing things. Little things at first, easily dismissed. The sound of raised voices late at night. The way Sarah's cheerful waves became less frequent, her gardening sessions shorter and more hurried. The way she started wearing long sleeves even on warm days. One morning, I was getting my newspaper when I saw Sarah rushing to her car. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, even though the day was overcast. As she fumbled with her keys, the glasses slipped, and I caught a glimpse of her face. There was a shadow around her left eye that makeup couldn't quite hide. She saw me looking and quickly pushed the glasses back into place. "Walked into a door," she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "I'm such a klutz sometimes. I wanted to say something. But what?" I had no proof, just a growing sense of unease and a collection of small observations that might mean everything or nothing at all. So I just nodded and watched her drive away, hating myself for my cowardice. The incidents started happening more frequently after that. The arguments became louder, though I could never quite make out the words. Objects would crash against walls, followed by periods of unsettling silence. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I'd hear car doors slam and engines start, only to have James's SUV return an hour or two later. Sarah stopped tending to her garden altogether. The roses she'd planted withered and died, untended. When I did see her, she was different, quieter, more withdrawn. The bright, friendly woman who had waved to me that first day seemed to be fading away, replaced by a shadow that hurried between house and car, head down, avoiding eye contact. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I saw and heard. Looking back, I think I was trying to convince myself that I wasn't imagining things, that my concerns were real and justified. The entries read like a countdown to disaster. October 15th. Argument at 11:30 p.m. Sounds of breaking glass. Sarah's car gone by midnight, back by 2 a.m. October 23rd. Sarah wearing scarf despite warm weather. Noticed her hands shaking while getting mail. October 30th. Loud crash around 9 p.m. Police drive by but don't stop. No lights on in house for rest of night. November began with a week of relative quiet. I almost convinced myself things were getting better. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just past midnight, and I was up late finishing a book when I heard the screaming. Not the muffled arguments I'd grown accustomed to, but real, terrified screaming. I was at my window before I even realized I'd moved, peering through the gaps in my blinds. The lights were on in the Bennett's kitchen, casting long shadows on their driveway. I could see figures moving inside, one pursuing the other. Then Sarah burst out of the front door, barefoot and wearing what looked like pajamas. James was right behind her, his face contorted with rage. He caught her at the end of the driveway, grabbing her arm with such force that she spun around. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, loud enough for me to hear clearly through my closed window. I had my phone in my hand, 911 already dialed, but my finger hovered over the call button. What if I was wrong? What if this was just a bad argument? What if calling the police made things worse? Then I saw him hit her. The sound of his hand connecting with her face seemed to echo through the quiet street. Sarah crumpled to the ground, and James stood over her, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. I pressed call. The operator's voice was calm and professional as I reported what I was seeing. She assured me help was on the way and asked me to stay on the line. By then, James had dragged Sarah back inside. The house went dark, but I could still hear muffled sounds of struggle. The police arrived with their lights off, rolling quietly down our street. 2 officers approached the front door while another went around back. The knock seemed deafening in the midnight quiet. James answered the door looking perfectly composed, as if he hadn't just assaulted his wife in the driveway. I could hear his voice, smooth and reasonable, explaining that everything was fine, just a little argument that got out of hand. The officers insisted on seeing Sarah. There was a long pause before she appeared beside James, wearing a different outfit than before. Even from my window, I could see the fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. One officer engaged James in conversation, while another spoke quietly to Sarah. I saw her glance at James, then back at the officer. Her shoulders started shaking, and then, finally, she nodded. The change in James was instant and terrifying. He lunged for Sarah, but the officers were ready. Within moments, he was on the ground, being handcuffed while he shouted threats and obscenities. Sarah stood on the porch, hugging herself and crying as a female officer gently draped a blanket around her shoulders. I watched as they put James in the back of a patrol car. He was still yelling, his face twisted with rage as he stared at Sarah through the window. Another officer led Sarah to a different car, presumably to take her statement somewhere safe. The next few hours were a blur of police activity. More officers arrived, taking photos and collecting evidence. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. I gave my statement, showing them my journal of incidents and describing what I'd witnessed that night. It was nearly dawn when things finally quieted down. Sarah didn't return to the house. The female officer who had comforted her told me she was being taken to a safe location. James was in custody, facing multiple charges of domestic assault. In the days that followed, the story came out in pieces. Sarah's sister arrived from out of state to pack up her belongings. She told me that James had been controlling and abusive throughout their 3-year marriage, but his wealth and connections had always protected him. Sarah had tried to leave before, but he'd always found her, always convinced her to come back. She was planning to leave for good. Her sister explained as we watched movers pack Sarah's things into a truck. She'd been saving money in secret, making plans. He must have found out somehow. The house at number 42 stands empty again now. The garden Sarah never got to finish is more overgrown than ever. Sometimes, when I look at it, I think about all the signs I saw but didn't act on sooner. I think about how many nights I lay awake listening to their arguments, telling myself it wasn't my business. 6 months have passed. I got a card from Sarah last week, postmarked from another state. "She's safe," she wrote, starting over. She thanked me for making the call that night, for being the witness she needed. "Sometimes," she wrote, "the hardest step is knowing someone else sees what's happening, that you're not crazy or imagining things." James is awaiting trial. His expensive lawyers are working hard to minimize the charges, but the evidence is overwhelming. My journal, the photos of Sarah's injuries, the testimony of other neighbors who had seen and heard things but, like me, had stayed silent too long. It all adds up to a story that can't be explained away. I've started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter. I want to help other women find their way out of situations like Sarah's. But mostly, I want to make sure I never stay silent again when I see something wrong. Because here's what I've learned. Evil doesn't just exist in dramatic movies or news headlines. Sometimes it lives right next door, hiding behind expensive suits and charming smiles. And when it does, staying quiet isn't being polite or minding your own business. It's being complicit. The new owners of number 42 move in next week. I've already bought a welcome gift, not an orchid this time, but a book about local resources for women, just in case. Because now I know that being a good neighbor sometimes means being willing to see the things others try to hide, and being brave enough to do something about it. Sarah's roses never got the chance to bloom in that garden, but somewhere, in another state, I like to think she's planting new ones. And this time, they'll have the chance to grow strong and free, reaching for the sun without fear of being crushed. As for me, I keep watching and listening, not just at number 42, but all around our quiet suburban street. Because I've learned that the most dangerous predators don't lurk in dark alleys. They live in houses with perfectly manicured lawns, hide behind respectable jobs and expensive cars, and count on their neighbors' silence to keep their victims trapped. Never again, I promise myself, never again will I choose comfort over courage, politeness over protection. Sometimes, being a good neighbor means being willing to be uncomfortable, to get involved, to speak up when something feels wrong. Because in the end, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to convince themselves that it's none of their business. Thank you for staying with me through this powerful story. Stories like these are important to share because they remind us that we all have the power to make a difference in someone's life. Sometimes, being brave enough to speak up can change, or even save, someone's life. If you found this story meaningful, please consider taking a moment to like this video. Your engagement helps these important messages reach more people who might need to hear them. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories that shine a light on real-world issues. Hit that notification bell to make sure you never miss our new uploads.